Today, we're talking about one of the greatest threats to the US Constitution in history and possibly one of the biggest political scandals to ever rock the USA. That's right, Watergate. Watergate really began long before the actual break-in, and to understand it, we really need to understand its motivations. Now, in 1952, Richard Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower, and he decided to run for president in 1960 against John F. Kennedy. A US poll during these elections found that those who had watched the two candidates on television often favored Kennedy, while those who had heard the two candidates on radio often favored Nixon. This was probably due to Kennedy's youthful charisma and charming appearance, which was especially evident on television. This made Nixon pretty paranoid, so in 1968, when he was finally elected president, he set up CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, though the acronym sounds far more fitting.
Morbo congratulates our gargantuan cyborg president.
In fact, Nixon was so paranoid that in 1971 he set up a tape recording system in the Oval Office to tape all conversations and phone calls going in and out. This would prove to become a major problem for him later on. And thus began Phase 1. On June 17, 1972, 5 burglars were caught trying to break into the Democratic Party offices in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward found that 4 of the 5 burglars had connections to CREEP. The other guy was kind of just a locksmith. A lot of the journalists' information came from an anonymous whistleblower called Deep Throat, with Deep alluding to his deep background and Throat alluding to the fact that he only used oral communication, as well as Deep Throat being a popular pornography movie at the time. Later on in 2005, Deep Throat was revealed to be W. Mark Felt, and a former associate director of the FBI. A few days following the break-in, Nixon secretly ordered $500,000 in hush money to be given to the burglars for their silence. Nixon also tried to stop the FBI investigation by destroying evidence and firing staff who would not cooperate with him, a clear abuse of presidential power and obstruction of justice.
I have never obstructed justice.
In a speech to the public, Nixon strongly denied any involvement to the case, despite George McGovern, aka the Democratic opposition, accusing him of being involved with the break-in.
That I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook.
Lucky for Nixon, the public believed him, so in November of 1972, he won in a landslide victory.
Nixon's back!
Then, in 1973, the 7 people accused of being involved in Watergate went on trial. Some of Nixon's aides testified before a grand jury about the president's crimes. They also testified that Nixon had taped conversations that took place in the Oval Office. During the summer of 1973, Nixon struggles to protect the tapes from the Senate, as well as the appointed special prosecutor Archibald Cox. When Cox began to get on Nixon's nerves, he fired him, and several Justice Department officers resigned in protest. The new appointed special investigator, Leon Jaworski, also demands the tapes, so Nixon releases some of them with massive unexplained gaps in the recordings. In July of 1974, the Supreme Court orders Nixon to turn over the tapes, and the House of Representatives votes to impeach him for abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and obstruction of justice. Finally, in August of 1974, Nixon releases the tapes, and they prove 2 things. 1, that Nixon was always involved in the Dirty Tricks campaign, and 2, that Nixon had repeatedly tried to cover up the truth. To avoid being impeached, Nixon resigns on August 8, 1974, and he becomes the first and only president to resign from office. The next president, General Ford, pardons him of all his crimes, saying he did not want to drag out the crime for years in court. So what are some of the effects of Watergate? First of all, although Nixon managed to escape the justice system, his aides were not so lucky and they got sent to federal prison. It is often argued that Watergate kind of overshadows Nixon's achievements as president. Nixon worked really hard to improve relations between the USA and China, and even convinced the USSR to reduce their arms by a little bit. There was also a great deal of legislation pushed forward by Congress in order to try and limit the power of the president. The Watergate scandal changed American politics forever. It added further disappointment to a nation already scarred by the losses of the Vietnam War. Americans became more cynical of their politicians, and the reputation of U.S. politics worldwide was damaged. He set up a tape recording system in the Oval Office to tape all cone falls and conversations. Ha ha ha. Okay.